Well, good morning. What a pleasure to join you this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me here to join you. I want to talk this morning about a very simple question. Why America? What does it mean to be an American? Why did your family and my family come to America? I ask that question because we're at a time of intense political division, intense debates about who we are as Americans, what it means to be American, and what kind of future America's future is going to be. Now, for everyone here, we are the product of our family stories. We are the product of the journey that brought us to this point here today. For me, many of you know my dad. My dad, if you go back to 1954, was a teenager, high school kid. He was involved in student council in Cuba when he got invited to be part of the revolution. And the revolution in Cuba, it was a lot of kids. Fidel Castro was a student council leader in college. By the way, I did student council in high school. It had no resemblance to a guerrilla movement. We were much geekier in my student council. But my father found himself as a teenager in 1954 and 55 and 56 and 57 being part of the revolution, fighting a war against Batista, a cruel, corrupt, oppressive dictator. And when my dad was 17, but Batista's police captured him and imprisoned him and tortured him. They beat him halfway to death in a Cuban jail. He didn't know if he was going to live or he was going to die. Now, thankfully, they ended up letting him out of that jail. But when they let him go, they began following him everywhere he went. Because they knew he was part of the revolution, part of the underground. They were hoping he would lead them to others in the underground. At that point, my grandfather said, "You just got to get out of the country. If you stay here, they're going to kill you." So my dad at the time, he applied to 3 U.S. universities, applied to University of Miami, LSU, and University of Texas. UT was the first one that let him in, which is how I came to be a Texan. And so in 1957, my dad, he got on a ferry boat from Cuba over to Key West. He got in a Greyhound bus and took a Greyhound bus from Key West all the way to Austin, Texas. And in Austin, 18 years old, he had nothing, had $100 in his underwear. Couldn't speak English. His first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. Now, why did he have that job? Well, because he couldn't speak English. And you didn't have to speak English to wash dishes. He could do that in any language. Now, my dad had a pretty acute incentive to learn English. Why? Well, he was enrolled at the University of Texas, and his classes were all in English. And if he didn't pass his classes, if he flunked out, they would revoke his student visa. And if they revoked his student visa, they'd send him back to Cuba. And if they sent him back to Cuba, they'd kill him. So my father had an intense incentive to learn English and learn it quickly. So he did a couple of things. One of the things my dad did, he signed up for Spanish 101. And he reverse engineered the class. So the professor would be up front saying, "Milk is leche." And he'd be sitting there writing, "Okay, leche is milk. Okay, that's good. That's helpful." The other thing my dad used to do is on Saturdays, he'd go to the movies. And he'd sit and watch the same movie 3 times in a row. Just spend the whole afternoon watching it. And the human mind is an amazing thing. By the second or third time, you start picking up the context, you start understanding, and you just start understanding the language. Well, history was, of course, continuing to move forward for everybody else. So while my dad is in Austin getting started as a student, My aunt, my tia Sonia, his younger sister, was back in Cuba. By the way, in my family, I also call her mi tia loca. There's a reason my aunt is not allowed to talk to the press. There's kind of a hierarchy in my family. I'm the calmest, most mellow one. Then there's my father. And then there's my aunt. God love her. My aunt, when I was growing up as a kid, she used to have these chancletas, which her daughter, Bibi's 5 years older than I am, the two of us would be playing and getting in trouble, and somehow my tia could pull off that chancleta, and you could be 30 feet away and just, whoo, boom, and she'd drop you to the ground. But my tia was still back in Cuba in '59 when Castro wins the revolution. Revolution succeeds, a brief moment of celebration. And then Castro declares to the world he's a communist and begins lining up and executing dissidents, begins seizing people's lands. And Cuba discovered that they went from one SOB to an even worse SOB. So my aunt is still back there, and she does the obvious next step. She joins the counter-revolution, fighting against Castro after he's taken over. My tia, among other things, went and burned fields down in acts of protest to the new regime. And then my aunt ends up being thrown in prison as well and tortured by Castro's goons. And then a few years later, she too flees Cuba, comes to America, comes to Texas. Now, I tell that story because everyone here has a story like that. Everyone here has a story. Look, some of us, maybe it's you. Others, maybe it's your parents or your grandparents, or your great-great-great-great-grandparents. But the story of America is a story of risking everything for freedom. And if you think about it, if you actually designed this country as a social experiment, you sat down a group of sociologists and said, we're going to design a country. And for 400 or 500 years, we're going to sort. We're going to bring people from all over the world. Who are we going to bring? Well, we're not going to bring the richest. We're not going to bring the smartest. Sorry about that. That was not who we collectively were. We're not going to bring the strongest. We're going to bring the people crazy enough to risk everything for freedom. And generation after generation after generation, give me those across the globe who value being free above everything else and are willing to put it all on the line because your heart yearns to breathe free. That's America. That's who we are. Now, there's all sorts of different manifestations of freedom. There's freedom from oppression. Freedom not to have the police or army kick in the door and throw you in jail and torture you. Our neighbors in Venezuela haven't experienced that freedom in a long time. There's freedom of speech. The right to stand up and speak whether you're right or wrong. The right to call your president an ass. That's true regardless of what party he is. And it's often been true regardless of what party they are. But that freedom of speech, what an incredible liberty. Now think about the debates we're having right now on college campuses, where college administrators say, no, you can't be expressing that view. No, we're going to censor what you say. No, those ideas are scary. They're dangerous. If you think about why your family and my family came to America, it was precisely because you didn't have some higher power deciding what you get to say and what you don't get to say. It was because we wanted that freedom of speech. We wanted the freedom of religion. That every one of us, the right to worship God, to live according to our faith and conscience. A faith journey different for each one of us. But it's not the government that gets to decide who and how and when we worship. And then there's the freedom of our dreams. You know, most of the history of mankind has been a history of oppression. It's been a history of kings and queens. It's been a history of power from the top down. And it's been a history of whatever station you were born into, that is the station in which you shall stay. If you're blessed and you're born into the family of aristocrats and royalty, well, then you can live the life of kings. But if you're born into the home of a cobbler, then a cobbler you shall be. That, at the end of the day, is a freedom that is right at the heart of what America is. Any one of us, doesn't matter where we come from, doesn't matter what we started with, doesn't matter if we could speak English when we got started, doesn't matter if we were washing dishes. What matters in America is how big your heart is, and how big your dream is, and how hard you were willing to work to achieve that dream, and how hard you are willing to work when you fail. And note I said the word when and not if. A few weeks ago, my daughter Caroline, who's 10, she played in her 5th grade basketball team. I was one of the assistant coaches on the team. They made it all the way to the finals, and they lost by 1 point. And I had a crying little 10-year-old asking me, "Dad, why did we lose?" And I said, look, losing is part of life, but it's especially part of an extraordinary life. You made it to the finals, and next year you're going to win. But I told her, look, I'll tell you something. I had for years, I kept a file folder labeled failures. But I just collected everything I tried and failed. I said, you know, Caroline, if you don't ever fail at anything, it means you're not trying anything. Here's an easy path to never, ever, ever fail. Sit in your room, stare at the ceiling. You'll never fail. You will accomplish nothing, but you'll never fail. And that's the incredible thing about America, is that you can go and fail and get punched in the face and then get yourself back up again. And if you still have the burning desire, if you still have the vision, you can climb the mountaintop. That's the freedom. Look, small businesses. If you care about jobs and economic growth, you care about small businesses. Why? 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. How do we get small businesses to grow? Well, it ain't rocket science. There are 2 major tools that government has: tax reform and reg reform. And history is real simple. Every time we cut taxes, simplify the tax code, every time we repeal job-killing regulations, the exact same thing happens, which is more and more small businesses are started, grow, expand, create jobs and opportunity. By the way, the converse is equally true. Every time we go down the path of higher taxes, higher regulations, bigger government, you see economic stagnation. You see small businesses struggling and gasping. We're seeing the results right now of an economy that's booming. We all know the basic numbers, the lowest unemployment in over 50 years. The lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded. The lowest African American unemployment ever recorded. The lowest Asian American unemployment ever recorded. The lowest unemployment for women in 70 years. Look, these are incredible results, but we shouldn't be surprised. Because if we understand where we started, why America, what is it that brought our families to America? It's that in most of the rest of the world, you can't do what you can do here. We're entering the 2020 presidential cycle. On the Democratic side, we have, I think, currently 386 candidates for president. But they're just getting started. And we are seeing a cascade to the left. Socialism. You want socialism? 70% tax rate, I'll give you 80. How about 80? Give me 90. This is a moment where our country has a debate who we are and what do we believe. And I'll tell you, in the Hispanic community, we're blessed to have a reason to understand. One of the ways you lose liberty is you take it for granted. Our community is blessed that typically our journey to freedom is much more recent and acute than many other Americans. That means it's harder to forget. Let me encourage you, don't forget. January 2013, when I was first sworn into office in the Senate, the Bible that I was sworn in on was my father's Bible. Today, my dad's a pastor. And as I was taking the oath, I couldn't help but thinking back to 1957. Thinking back to that teenage kid washing dishes for 50 cents an hour. And if someone had come to my dad then and said, your son, 50 years from now, will be a United States Senator representing the state of Texas. My dad never could have imagined that. That teenage immigrant, it was easier to imagine flying to the moon than that possibility. And there my father was, sitting in the Senate gallery with tears streaming down his face. And as he said that day, only in America. What we have here is special. It is unique. It is precious. And it is very much worth fighting for. And I'm proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with each of you, fighting to preserve and protect the freedom that makes America that shining city on a hill. Thank you.